My chapter explores the role of the state at the Frida River project in Papua New Guinea. There are a few things you should probably know about the Frida River project. It is located in a very remote area, even by Papua New Guinea standards. Provision of government services and civic infrastructure in this part of the country is extremely limited, and government representatives are largely absent from the area. What you also need to know is that Frida River gold and copper mine does not yet exist. Not in a conventional sense anyway. Saying that, 6 decades of exploration activities led to emergence of a series of local and non-local stakeholder groups and categories, each with an interest or a stake, if you like, in a mine that is not yet there. My chapter looks at what I term categorical dissonance, which contrasts expectations of perceived roles and responsibilities with what actually happens on the ground where these roles and categories are enacted in resource contexts. It uses ethnographic material collected among community members, company employees, as well as government representatives, to explore a peculiar absent presence of the state at Frida River, and the range of effects this creates. The chapter describes how local communities in the project area became disillusioned with the state that was present through legislation they could neither understand nor leverage, but whose representatives were nearly completely absent from their communities. Instead, community members vested their hopes in the relationships they formed with mining company personnel. Rather unsurprisingly, the latter felt uncomfortable with refracted responsibilities and the pressure they had found themselves under to fulfill what they saw as the role and responsibility of the state. But they had found themselves forced to take on what they would describe as the role of a quasi-government to allow their own exploration activities at Frida to continue.
G'day, let me take you to the highlands of Papua New Guinea. Angkor Province is the home of the Porgera gold mine. It is also the location of many law and order problems, including gender-based violence, tribal feuding, and large-scale riots. The state should be present to create law and order, but in fact it is absent. My chapter asks, why? Here is a common answer. When Papua New Guinea was a colony, Australia pacified the highlands. Upon independence, anger slid back into tribal fighting and violence. My chapter shows this answer is wrong. In fact, the Australian administration never brought law and order to Enga. It was underfunded and lacked capacity. Rather, Engans themselves stopped fighting in anticipation of the development that the Australians promised. This prosperity never arrived and so fighting resumed. But now it was worse because of firearms. Thus, in some sense, law and order problems intensified because of the arrival of Australian governance. The PNG government inherited the problems the Australians had created. Porgera has never had Western-style law and order, and its current extreme problems are a result of failures in governance that are as old as the governance itself. Some major conclusions. First, we should re-examine common narratives of Australian rule. Second, we must look at resource conflict in historical and regional context. Third, we will only solve problems at resource developments if we solve the problems of the broader region where they are located. Thanks for watching.
In this chapter, we examine how the state is instantiated and experienced in Melanesian mining settings. Local perceptions of the government's failure to protect the interests of the people coincide with those of analysts who've characterised Papua New Guinea as a weak, fragile or failing nation state. Our purpose is to move beyond these default descriptions. We argue that the state exhibits a selective and strategic presence throughout the life cycle of resource extraction projects. At different times, it will be more or less present for different actors and institutions, resulting in the prioritisation of some interests and the marginalisation of others. The state often exhibits a heightened presence in these settings through the local agreements to which it is a party and the obligations that it habitually fails to enact. This absent presence creates situations where mining companies are routinely manoeuvred into being like a state. The failure of the state to fulfil its duties in regards to the regulation of the industry and the management and implementation of benefit sharing agreements, for example, frequently forces companies to fill these gaps when they would rather concentrate on the task of extracting natural resources and accumulating capital. To illustrate this point, we describe how these processes and the absent presence phenomena have unfolded around a large-scale gold mining project in the Lihir group of islands in Papua New Guinea. Even though the state often appears to be invisible in Lihir, the idea of the state has served as a point of reference for actions carried out by a local public administration, community members, and the company. These manoeuvrings and manipulations are not simply the result of government absence and inaction or corporate acquiescence to community demands. Contemporary events and processes have historical roots that are unearthed or brought to the surface through the work of resource extraction. For this reason, the absent presence of the state must be understood within its historical context.
My chapter, Absence as a Moral Act, examines ExxonMobil's Papua New Guinea liquefied natural gas project in the Papua New Guinean Highlands province of Hela. This project was conceived as a nation-building project, and the abject failure of this project to deliver on its promises of development has had the paradoxical effect of highlighting the absence of the state as a development agent, and therefore magnifying the idea of the state via its very absence. State absence was brought into stark relief in the wake of the magnitude 7.5 earthquake that struck the province in February 2018. Damage to infrastructure and people's lives caused by this earthquake only highlighted the impact that state absence has on the province. In writing the chapter, I was forced to confront the old question of how to define the state, and realise that the state can be understood as a value proposition held by a collective. The Huli people of Hela province, which hosts the gas resource, largely view the LNG project in prophetic terms, as an ancestral resource that exists for the benefit of the province, provided that they don't give the gas away to someone like a foreign developer such as ExxonMobil. Hela province can be understood as an indigenous nation within a nation state, and indeed the state does exist as a value proposition even when that proposition fails to deliver on its expectations. Development failure is a moral failure, both in terms of the self-perceived responsibility of the landowners as custodians of the gas resource, and of the state and ExxonMobil as a tool of the state in its failure to honour its promises of development.
Good day everyone, and thank you for your interest in our volume, which includes my chapter that explores societal risk debates associated with large-scale unconventional gas developments in Australia. So drawing on ethnographic research within one of the main extractive regions for these gas projects, my chapter engages with accounts of residents who had various types of environmental and health-related concerns associated with the industry, and I'm specifically interested in the role of the state in this regard. But rather than looking at the state as a set of institutions or practices, I'm much more interested in how the state comes into being in the daily lives of these residents. And what I found is that these residents often found themselves being sent around different agencies or government departments with their concerns without really receiving clear answers to their questions. Or worse still, in some cases, they encountered what I call the displacement of state functions, for example, risk assessment, to industry proponents who then passed on that information. So that leaves us with a really interesting, almost contradictory dynamic where the state is really very present in some sense, for example, by granting extraction licenses, and on the other is perceived to be absent in its ability to or willingness to address concerned residents' questions. So I use some of the work of the late Ulrich Beck around the notion of organized irresponsibility to look a little bit deeper into these questions, and then how residents also responded to this perceived irresponsibility by taking it up on themselves to, for example, scrutinize the industry and conduct their own research. And I think this also speaks to a lot of other contributions within this volume, is that this raises some very interesting and important questions around the relationship between the states, its citizens, and then of course private extractive companies. So I hope you enjoy my chapter and my colleagues' contributions, and I really invite you to critically engage with the concept of absent presence in your own research. Thank you.
Hi, I'm Sarah Holcomb. Junior mining companies, or mining juniors as they're referred to, are by far the most predominant mineral and precious metals mining companies operating both in Australia and globally. Yet for a range of reasons that my chapter, Chapter 7, begins to explore, their operations are rarely the subject of research. A focus on junior miners provides an important and largely overlooked window into the strategic presence and absence of the state in resource extraction contexts, and helps to reveal the structural factors that shape the relationship between miners and Indigenous communities. My chapter addresses this gap in the Australian context by exploring the political economy within which a mining junior is seeking to develop several mineral deposits on Aboriginal land in the top end of the Northern Territory, or the NT. My chapter sets out to achieve three things. In the first part, I provide an overview of this particular mining project and the key features of junior miners. I then consider the regulatory limitations within the environmental and social impact assessment processes in the NT in comparison with other Australian jurisdictions, and the way that junior mining companies have been able to take advantage of this form of absence to the detriment of Aboriginal communities in mine-affected areas. This provides the basis to consider the disconnection between this impact assessment process and the agreement-making process for which provision is made under the Aboriginal Land Rights Act and native title legislation. The Northern Territory, or the NT, is a unique jurisdiction in Australia. Not only do Aboriginal people hold 50% of the land as inalienable freehold title, as possibly the strongest form of land rights globally, but much of the remaining land is also subject to native title rights and interests. They also make up more than 30% of the NT population. While this land tenure in the NT appears to provide the Aboriginal landowners with a powerful and strategic political position, the regulatory and governance environment diminishes these rights at both territory and federal levels. A significant mechanism leading to marginalisation of these interests in development of these lands occurs principally through the territory level environmental impact assessment process. As these EIS processes treat Aboriginal landholders as simply another set of stakeholders, the usual do no harm approach of conventional social impact assessments is revealed as deeply inadequate and flawed for this remote context, where 80% of the population identify as Indigenous and where there are significant structural deficits in health, housing, education, and so on. My chapter delves into the limitations of this state-led paradigm of extractives-led development in this Aboriginal domain. One of the conclusions is that in this context of extractive capitalism, while it may appear that these Aboriginal interests are appropriately served by their collective representative bodies, the land councils, and specific legislation such as the Aboriginal Land Rights Act, without intersecting and supportive state policy and legislation, the contest between Indigenous and non-Indigenous interests continues. Thank you.
Hi, my name is Gareth Lewis. I'm an applied anthropologist based out of Darwin in the Northern Territory of Australia. So greetings from Larrakia country. I'm the author of a chapter in the Absent Presence ANU ePress volume edited by Nick and Amelia. I wrote chapter 8, which is entitled Broken Promise Men, the malevolent absence of the state at the McArthur River Mine, Northern Territory. I've worked with local Aboriginal groups across the Gulf region of the Territory for many years in relation to the McArthur River Mine and other matters. In doing so, I've been inspired by the quite different life stories and personalities of two key Aboriginal protagonists with whom I've engaged in the extremely complicated, murky and contested space of the McArthur River Mine. The stories, voice, song and art of these two men has inspired me to frame the very different discursive journeys that they've taken against the history not only of the McArthur River Mine, but also the history of their people's violent encounters on the colonial frontiers of the Gulf country since the late 1800s. Their stories are part of a broader Aboriginal discourse which maps a continuum of experience of the malevolent absence of the state in the Gulf country from the colonial era manifesting state-sponsored genocide meted out on Aboriginal people by police and civilians, through to a less violent but nonetheless still culturally devastating disempowerment of Aboriginal people in the face of the state-sponsored major mining development, which is literally reshaping the traditional lands of the Gurindji people. So while the extractive resource has shifted from cattle to minerals, and the methodologies have become less violent, emanations of power from guns to mineral leases, the state's objective has remained consistent, the removal of Aboriginal people as impediments to extraction. The state has met their objective in a consistent manner over time. for the concealment of its presence through the devolution of authority to remote actors, police and pastoralists literally being given a licence to kill in the past, and now miners being given approvals to transform the landscape. The state has maintained its presence behind a symbolic yet malevolent absence. The late Mr. Coolabah's narrative of the broken promise man trope is presented in contrast to Jack Green's protest actions, art and song. The discursive trajectories of these men's lives demonstrate their contrasting responses as extractive subjects to the corporate power and thereby absent presence of the state. I wish to give my thanks to Nick and Amelia for their wonderful editorial work on this volume, and note that I'm very proud to be amongst the ensemble of great contributors for this pretty important collection. Thanks very much. Bye.
Hi everyone, thank you for inviting us to talk about our chapter. We wish we could be there in person. Our chapter is called The State's Stakes at the Century Mine, 1992 to 2012. It was co-authored by Dr. Joanne Everingham, Professor David Trigger and myself, Julia Keenan from the University of Queensland. It focuses on Century Mine, which is in the lower Gulf of Carpentaria region of far northwest Queensland. I realise that might not mean a lot to you, but the important thing to know is that it's very far away from the capital city, Brisbane. It's over 2,000 kilometres. I've checked this on a map for you, and it's about as far from St Andrews as Seville, Naples or St Petersburg, but it's still in the same state. So though it's closed now, Century Mine was once the third largest zinc mine in the world. Century provides a distinctive example of the evolution of resource relations between governments, miners and local communities. It also evidences tensions in Australia between conceptions of the state's responsibilities to ensure economic development on the one hand, and the well-being of regional populations, particularly Indigenous peoples, on the other hand. This physical remoteness from key population centres, combined with the violent and repressive colonial history, contributed to the situation whereby in the 1990s, despite an abundance of natural assets, development in the lower Gulf region, especially for its Aboriginal residents, lagged behind that of most other regions of Queensland. The discovery of the Century deposit in 1990 on the Lawn Hill Station pastoral lease spurred exploration in the region and highlighted two factors shaping the government's role. First, the priority given to corporate interests as a foundation for regional development, and second, the historical record of officially denying and curtailing the rights of Indigenous peoples. In this chapter, we argue that because of the distinctive socio-political conditions, these two motives spurred an unusually prominent state presence in the pre-approvals phase of the mine. However, after the initial operational years, the state became more absent and adopted a less direct role, with contracted agencies delivering many government-funded programs and Indigenous residents depending on the mine for many functions. This temporal pattern in the state's active presence had consequences for the widely held expectation that locals should benefit from development of a mine, and that the state will ensure that mines are designed and operated in a way that builds local capacities, creates long-term economic and social opportunities, strengthens local communities, and preserves or rehabilitates local heritage and the environment. We observed that the fact that conditions of disadvantage persisted after the Century Mine project was underway, and even past its closure, calls into question a central tenet of trickle-down concepts of development and of Australian national development, namely the proposition that large-scale natural resource development is unambiguously beneficial to all of the citizenry. The final part of our chapter concludes by noting the disparate views revealed about how present the state should be in a development like Century Mine, and the critical yet fragile role that formal agreements can play in engaging the state and compelling its presence in mining-induced development, especially in peripheral localities. We hope that you enjoy it. Thank you.
Claire Levache and I are the authors of A State That Cannot Absent Itself, in which we make a comparison between New Caledonia, Papua New Guinea and Australia. We make a comparison on three axes. First is equity and ownership, the second is regulation of the mining industry, and the third is resource rents and benefit distribution. Take, for example, the issue of ownership. In Papua New Guinea, the state has often wanted to gain ownership of mining operations, but it has rarely had the capital to do so effectively. In New Caledonia, on the other hand, access to capital originating in France mean that local financing entities have been able to assist the provincial governments in both the North and South provinces to make major acquisitions in the mining sector. Two of the biggest operations in New Caledonia are now effectively in provincial government hands. The overall theme of the book is the presence or absence of the state in or near mining operations. What we said in our chapter is that the state can never be absent in New Caledonia. The special nature of the electoral process in New Caledonia means that citizens of the territory vote once, and their issues are carried through first to the provincial assemblies, then to the territorial assembly, and then again to the government of New Caledonia without any further return to the ballot box. This system was designed 3 decades ago to avoid the capture of the state by any one faction or interest group. It has served this purpose quite well over the last 3 decades. What it means, though, is that central issues, such as those of mining, are reflected in the same way in the heart of government as they are in communities around the territory of New Caledonia. We hope you enjoy our chapter.